And we're broadcasting. This is Seven Seas Cruising Association Boaters Advocacy Rights presentation. It's a consortium of many different boating groups, including AGLCA, DeFever Cruisers, MTOA, and SSCA. Thanks to our sponsor, Nauticad, who's made it possible for us to be able to be online and streaming. SSCA members get a trial of courses, and it's an excellent material online webinar series. I'd like to introduce Jerry Paul. Panelist Jerry Paul has been a cruiser most of his life. He lives aboard a trawler. You can see it behind him. He holds a 100-ton master license. He's an attorney and former member of the Florida legislature, a consultant with years of experience in Florida government. He's passionate about boating. He knows our environment. He's worked to provide boater rights for many years. He's currently with Capital Access in Tallahassee, Florida. We will also have a presentation or discussion by President of SSCA, Kingsley Ross. And I'd like to introduce Kim Russo. Kim has been director of America's Great Loop Cruisers Association, AGLCA, for 5 years. She's a frequent speaker about the Great Loop at the largest boat shows in the United States, including Chicago, Miami, St. Pete, San Francisco, New England, Cruisers University, and Trawler Fest. In addition to managing the 7,000 members and sponsors of AGLCA, Kim's role includes advocacy efforts on behalf of our members to ensure waterways remain open and cruiser friendly. Kim has also served as the executive director of the SSCA and treasurer of the SSCA Foundation. I would like to turn this over now to Jerry, and I'll stop the share. And Jerry, would you like to tell us about your program, what you can do for advocacy and to help us?
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be with you this evening. You know, this event tonight actually demonstrates one of the reasons why we have had success through the collective efforts of the members of these wonderful organizations. America's Great Loop Cruising Association, Seven Seas Cruising Association, the Marine Trawler Owners Association, and of course the DeFever Users Group. It's because the active members, the ones who are listening tonight, the ones who take the time to listen and to dial in and to figure out what they can do to preserve our freedom on the water. It's the reason, it's the way that we have been able to preserve these freedoms and these rights year after year here in Florida, here in the capital city of Tallahassee. I can tell you that the importance of engaging, the importance of this grassroots organization through events like tonight and supporting these efforts is as crucial now as it's ever been. You know, Florida has 400 years of maritime heritage where men and women on vessels can anchor offshore or in their intercoastal waterways, quite frankly, long before anybody else was in the peninsular state. And just as the history of America started with the pace setters sailing and cruising and anchoring in Florida, so too today. What happens in Florida becomes a roadmap of policy for what happens in all other coastal states. We in Florida, like in other states, have experienced demographic changes, however, and as the population changes, fewer and fewer people who have moved here have necessarily that deep and rich maritime vein running through them. And so oftentimes they come to Tallahassee and they try to limit, restrict, even ban the anchoring of our vessels. Much of it is based upon, I would say, a misunderstanding about the cruising lifestyle, but it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of resources to constantly make the case, to constantly meet with and speak with the host of legislators who vote on these bills in the Capitol. The can spell the difference between our ability to enjoy this lifestyle, to be able to anchor offshore, to be close to nature and close to the water versus having all of our anchorages banned. We've made tremendous progress over the years. This is my 30th legislative session in Tallahassee. It's my 6th or 7th one representing this host of organizations. At the time that, going back to my time when I served in the legislature, we would see efforts from time to time of communities coming forward and wanting to ban anchoring, but not nearly as much, in part because they had the authority on the local level to ban anchoring on their own. As they did that more and more, it created a patchwork of restrictions and even outright bans. As boaters moved through jurisdictions on the water, it became very difficult to decipher those different laws. A few years ago, one of the things that we accomplished, the 4 organizations that organized this event tonight through their lobbying efforts, was to accomplish preemption, meaning that all regulations related to anchoring and mooring are preempted to the state level so that local governments could no longer create that messy patchwork. That was a huge success for us, but the fight continues. Each and every year, there are local governments who get their legislators, their member of the House or their member of the Senate or both, to come to Tallahassee during our annual legislative session and file bills to change the law statewide, carving out specific listed anchorage areas where they want to ban our vessels from anchoring. We fight against those every day, all day, 365 days a year. We're only able to do that. We're only able to leverage our political capital, our contacts, our access, if you will, if the resources are there to wage our continuous campaign. Tonight's a wonderful opportunity to talk a little more detail about some of the policy initiatives that are about to take center stage during the upcoming legislative session here in Florida. And hopefully we'll be able to, again, build and rebuild our host of supporters who will help us continue to be able to defend our freedom on the water.
Jerry, are you there or did we drop you?
I'm still here. So I think you may now be turning it over to perhaps Kingsley or Kim. I'd certainly be willing to answer any questions about the legislation that's currently being filed. I alluded to it a moment ago, but we have a host of bills that are being filed in the Capitol as we speak, as we're about to begin our 60-day legislative session. And those bills would severely restrict or even ban anchoring in particular locations. One example is the Ortega River in Jacksonville, Duval area. There are several others, Riviera Beach, Venice, other locations where local governments have requested that their legislators ban anchoring. We fight actively every day, waging an advocacy campaign to avoid those and seek other alternatives that still preserve our freedom. And I'll stand by on this event and certainly take any questions that might be asked.
All right, I'm going to turn this over to Kingsley Ross and ask him to continue and discuss this topics of this program.
So Jerry, let's talk about what's happening or what's planned to be happening. What's the desire of the local community down in the Palm Beach area, so that people have an understanding of what they may be asked to help with.
So typically, and the Palm Beach issue is fairly typical, what happens is that a anchorage that many of us have enjoyed for many years as we cruise through Florida, either as residents cruising around the peninsular state, or as some of us passing through on our way to the Bahamas or back back from the Caribbean. We enjoy these anchorages, but more and more you see that there are some vessel owners who anchor their vessels there and leave them there as a long-term storage option. They may even leave them there to the point unmaintained where they become derelict or at risk of becoming derelict. Waterfront property owners see those vessels and they recoil against it. They make false assumptions that all of us and even those who are the owners of the derelict vessels are, for example, pumping all of our sanitary waste into the water. They're wrong about that, but they're not boaters. So for them, they simply believe that that's what's happening. They want to remove the derelict vessels as eyesores, which we tend to support as well. But for a whole host of reasons like that, they then come to their city council, waterfront property owners will come to the city council or the county commission and ask them to ban anchoring. The city council and the county commission attorneys will typically read the law, the preemption law that was passed a few years ago, and say, well, we don't have the authority to do that. It has to be done on the state level. And so then they ask their state legislators to file bills in Tallahassee to ban anchoring in specifically enumerated anchorages, like in Palm Beach County or in Riviera Beach or in Ortega River or in Venice. That's what's happening right now.
So in Riviera Beach, the plan is to create a series of mooring fields, is that right? And the area is just south of Peanut Island, correct?
That's right. So local governments, quite frankly, the city attorneys and county attorneys, of which I am a former one, they tend to initially get frustrated and then they get creative and they say, well, okay, we don't have the authority to ban anchoring, so let's come up with some clever other area where we're not preempted. Let's create a mooring field over the entire county or the entire waterway by process of elimination, eliminates all anchoring. So that's one of the efforts that is being attempted in Riviera Beach, either to create a broad mooring field over the same area or to come up with a quote unquote setback from mooring fields of 500 feet, for example, which in effect leaves as the area where you could still anchor an empty set. So that's one of the strategies being used there.
Okay, and so the legislation they've talked about, I don't believe I've seen it yet, you may have, but they've talked about is to try to change, in this case, to put the mooring fields in and to try to change the setback from, I think is in statute 100 feet. You can anchor up to 100 feet from a mooring field. They're proposing to go up to perhaps as much as 500 feet. Is that right?
That's right, which essentially eliminates all anchoring. The current law says that anchoring is not allowed within a setback of 100 feet of the boundary of a mooring field, but each local government has the authority to decrease that to 50 feet. In Monroe County, for example, is a county that chooses to exercise that authority for mooring fields such as Boot Key Harbor. But yes, it's 100 feet or down to 50, but Riviera Beach has proposed 500.
Right, and the significance of this particular location, besides it being having statewide implications, is that Peanut Island is a convenient jump-off place or a landing place for people on the way to or from the Bahamas. I've used it myself several times, and you can come in from the weather. It's a good opening. It's an easy cut, and what will happen is we just won't have a place to drop the hook. And
well, it's a terrible precedent as well. If this, I'll say, clever strategy were to work, if they were able to pass a bill saying that, then every local government where a handful of waterfront property owners complain would then use that loophole. They would maybe establish a mooring field with one mooring ball, but a 500-foot setback around it, so it'd be 1,000 feet radius, and eliminate every anchorage. They would systematically take every anchorage, plop down one mooring ball, and then have a 500 foot radius around it to eliminate the anchorage by anchorage. So it's a terrible precedent.
Right. And so in the Ortega area, I understand they're bringing some additional guns to the table this year. They tried something last year and that didn't get too far. But what are they planning on this year?
Well, as you said, last year they had their local a small group of people along the Ortega River pressed their legislator to file a bill that would ban anchoring in that anchorage on the Ortega River. It was driven ostensibly by a host of derelict vessels, and my understanding that the majority of the vessels that are anchored there are long-term stored vessels, not nearly as many, not very many transients, but some. And that legislator filed that bill. He also got it filed in the Senate, but then through the extraordinary grassroots efforts of AGLCA, MTOA, SSCA, and DeFever Group, our local folks really rallied and went to our local voter advisory group forced a vote on whether the voter advisory group itself supported it. They opposed it themselves, and then we were able to use that primarily in the Senate, but some in the House, to then deflate the momentum of that bill. That bill also became a magnet for a proposed anchoring ban in the Crystal River area, and we were able to deflate that as well. This year, that same group in the Ortega River area has also retained professional lobbyists, and they have been working very closely with the local legislator to draft a new bill. That bill has not been filed yet, although there's some discussion that the version this year may attempt to make a shift away from banning anchoring by location, but instead allowing local governments to restrict duration of anchoring in these locations. The thinking being that that would eliminate the derelict vessels and the long-term stored vessels, but still allow transient vessel owners to come through and anchor for a period of time as they move along Florida's waters.
Okay. So, and we also expect a bill from the Florida Wildlife Commission, correct?
That's correct. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission has this year, beginning at the end of the last legislative session, starting around May, said, well, next year, meaning this year, we're going to have a bill of our own that addresses a whole host of issues on the water, and some of them are going to involve anchoring and mooring. They put together a working group, including us, because we represent the Cruising Association, which has become a very powerful voice here in the Capitol. They've included us in that working group, and we participate in their calls and review legislative language all summer long, all fall, all winter, and right up until the beginning of the session, which is about to begin. FWC has now filed that bill on the House side. Through the collective efforts of those on this call right here, we have been able to keep all of the language in FWC's bill from impairing or restricting our ability to anchor. In the absence of your participation, your engagement, your eternal vigilance, if you will, I have little doubt that bills like that would still have some of the provisions that were originally proposed for it. I'll give you one example. Last year, they had proposed a provision that said that no vessel can anchor within 20 feet of any mangrove, which on its face may sound very environmentally friendly, but as those of us who anchor regularly know, that could essentially remove just about any anchorage. Any anchorage where a mangrove floats by, a mangrove nodule or pod, would then be banned. It would have empowered the government to force vessels to move from just about every anchorage. So we were able to get that language out, and throughout the course of this year leading up to this session, have monitored and tracked and participated actively through your collective efforts in making sure that that bill still preserves and protects our freedom on the water.
Jerry, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. In terms of the anchoring duration you mentioned a little while ago, what are you hearing is being may be proposed?
But that bill has not yet been filed, but the initial discussions are around a period of somewhere between 21 and 30 days, which some have suggested captures the vast majority of transient boaters who would anchor.
Okay, I have another question, which relates to the broader issue of derelicts and the pumping out or use of flow-through heads. And it basically says, what have you proposed to stop the long-term anchoring of derelict vessels that do not use pump outs? And I think it would be useful to talk about what the existing statutes require now in terms of derelicts, if possible. In other words, what are the limits?
Putting in place legislation regarding derelict vessels was a key component of slowing down and stopping this wave, this trend of trying to ban anchoring. We did the derelict vessel statute several years ago. That helped an awful lot. It authorizes the state to go out and remove those derelict vessels. Of course, that does still become a funding issue because it costs a lot to remove those vessels. We then added to that statute called vessels at risk of becoming derelict, and FWC is starting to work with that statute as well. Although all of these issues become somewhat more difficult to enforce on the water because it becomes somewhat subjective. For some people, a vessel that is derelict is not necessarily derelict to other people. But it has generally been working. It's generally been helping us distinguish between our transient cruisers and people who are simply leaving a vessel on the water long-term stored. One of our key strategies is to get FWC the adequate funding to go remove all of those truly derelict vessels and vessels at risk of becoming derelict. That frees up those anchorages for those who want to use them in a safe, environmentally friendly way, such as transient cruisers.
Can you share a little bit about what's happening in Venice and why we need to pay attention to that?
In Venice, Florida, for those who have cruised the Southwest Florida area, you may know that when you come in Venice Inlet and turn south on the ICW, immediately on your right is the yacht club, and there's a small number of vessels that typically fairly shallow draft vessels that anchor on the western or right-hand side of the ICW, co-located with the yacht club, and also a property right next to the yacht club is a youth sailing organization. Actually has 325 members. It's a very active competitive youth sailing program in that area. It's my former home district when I was a legislator. I'm very familiar with it. And but currently those youth have to sail their lasers and their 420s, their small vessels, and these are children in the 6, 8, 10-year-old range. They have to sail all the way across the Intracoastal Waterway through a fairly constricted and heavily trafficked area across to Roberts Bay and do their sail training and even their regattas. The local Venice Sailing School has approached the city of Venice over the last year and asked the city of Venice to help give them support to request from FWC, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, a vessel exclusion zone, which essentially is a separate statute that allows for the demarcation of an area for specific vessel activities. It's a statute that's been on the books for quite a while, and throughout the state of Florida, there are areas where particular activities are only allowed, such as rowing and crew, or sailing, or paddle boarding, or that sort of thing. The Venice Sailing School has proposed an area, however, that would encompass that area that I mentioned a moment ago, where some larger vessels tend to anchor. It's my understanding that the majority of the vessels in that fairly shallow anchorage are long-term stored vessels, but during any 1 to 2 week period of time, there's, my understanding, 3 or 4 transient vessels that come through. And if the entire area were marked off for the youth sailing school, then all of that area would be lost to anchoring. And so currently there is some discussion about whether they would be successful in getting a bill filed in the state legislature to ban anchoring outright there, which sets a bad example, a bad precedent, or whether some type of other compromise could be come up with to set off a portion that would be used for the youth sailing and retain a portion where transients could still anchor.
Okay. There's a question which I think is slightly above what we ask you to do, which is to see if you've heard of what's going on in other states north of Florida in terms of problems with derelict vessels and other issues. I will tell you that both SSCA now is monitoring 30 states and taking note of what's been going on. We've just started that. We know there's legislation, for instance, which may not be of particular interest to us, but is voting related legislation going up in Oregon. There's some legislation being implemented or proposed in South Carolina as it relates to the use of boats by individuals who are not appropriately trained. And we're actively doing it. AGLC is also monitoring a number of key states, and I'll let Kim speak to that later if she likes to, if she would like to. But we're basically looking in a much broader fashion than we've had in the past. But at this point, I don't have any key issues that I've seen yet come forward. But that's, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Jerry.
I would defer to Kim. I have enormous respect for the effectiveness of AGLCA and SSCA with some of the anchoring restriction legislation and getting it modified to be more user-friendly, more boater-friendly in Georgia. And Kim can talk quite a bit about that. But it is true that a lot of what happens in Florida does become a pattern that other states look to.
Yeah, and I'll just comment quickly on that. SSCA did a webinar, I think a few weeks back, on the situation in Georgia and the progress that has been made there. So certainly improvements in Georgia. I can tell you that the state of Virginia has convened basically a abandoned and derelict vessel working group that I'm participating with. So that's in its infancy there. And the subcommittees are studying things like putting together a register essentially of where the abandoned and derelict vessels are located, and then looking at funding and existing laws to rid the waterways of those hindrances to navigation, really. I think we agree. I know all of us on our committee here agree, but I think most of you watching would also agree. Derelict vessels are a big issue, and there is money and laws, never enough money, but some regulations take care of that. And it's unfortunate that the responsible cruisers, like our members are, kind of get caught up in that issue. So I think the work Jerry's doing to really kind of point out to a lot of these legislators that the issue is not anchoring. The issue is a boat that's been abandoned or is derelict or is violating other existing laws that should be enforced rather than putting in place anchoring bans. And Jerry's been real successful at explaining that to the folks that just aren't boaters and don't really understand how responsible cruisers operate. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jerry or Kingsley, whoever's up next.
Yeah, let me just add, in terms of Georgia, Ted Ariska and some others there, including a former legislator, have been extremely successful in doing that work. We've helped with that in a minor fashion, but they've been upfront and have done yeoman's work in terms of turning that around, changing a statute, and getting the commission or the state agency that enforces it to make some major changes that leave most of the anchorages intact, from what I can tell. And I would suggest, if you want more specific answers, you contact him. He's on Pederiska, he's on Facebook most of the time, and it's under Save George's Anchorages, I believe. So right now, we've got, if I'm counting them right, 4 hotspots. We've got Ortega River, we've got Deerfield, we've got Venice, and we've got the legislation from the Florida Wildlife Commission and Conservation Commission. And the issue that I've seen in the past in terms of these kinds of bills when they're put on the table is they open up a statute and they become a potential vehicle for amendments. You want to comment on that a little bit, Jerry?
Absolutely. It's an excellent point, Kingsley. Each year we hear about more and more local governments earlier and earlier in the process. Here, our annual 60-day legislative session begins on March 2nd, and already we know of 4 what you're calling hotspots. Typically, it's 1 or 2 by now. Usually, prior to session, we've heard of maybe half of the ones that we're going to hear about throughout by the time the session is over. So I suspect there's going to be more. And that's just a fact of life, something that we deal with. As government grows, as demographics change, trends emerge. And one of the trends is more and more restriction. And so we're going to see more and more of those hotspots. But the bigger, broader picture is not just the piecemeal hotspot, but rather the policy itself. And that's where we've made real progress in making more members of the legislature become more familiar with the cruising and boating and anchoring lifestyle. And that's what the resources of AGLCA and SSCA and MTOA and DeFever through the Boaters' Rights Group has done. Now, in a state like Florida, quite frankly, in any legislative body, you have legislators who term out, move on, and then you have new members. So it's constantly an effort to re-engage and build new relationships with the new freshman class as they begin their term in office. And so we constantly are doing that. This last legislative session, at the end of this last legislative session, we lost 2 or 3 of our strongest champions who had been there for us, defending our rights for 8 straight years. These were legislators from Monroe County, the Florida Keys, and they are greatly steeped in the saltwater lifestyle and were strong members of our Saltwater Caucus, which is the group of legislators who truly understand our issues. But we're actively working every day to recruit and nurture new members to that caucus, including the 2 newly elected legislators from the Keys, both in the House and the Senate. So we're going to see more and more of those hotspots, but what's equal, and we'll defend and push back and defeat each one of them with the support of those people listening in tonight. But in addition to that is continuing to blunt the overall trend of having the state change its policies back to the old days where local governments could create this patchwork of anchoring bans.
Okay. I'm trying to see if there may be another question. And I'm not seeing it. Just a moment, please. One individual was asking if you can provide any details to the FWC bill. He's asked if there's any thoughts of providing legislation that helps remove sunk vehicles in a more timely manner. It seems that sunk vessels take an excessive time due to ownership issues and the like.
Yes, one of the provisions in the FWC proposed language gives FWC additional authority to provide a notice to a vessel owner by giving notice to the vessel itself for a period of time. And if a response hasn't been received, then giving them the authority to declare it a derelict vessel. Of course, that's a touchy issue because that's obviously personal property. And so FWC has to be very careful. They certainly don't want to expose themselves to liability for destroying a vessel that is not truly derelict. But yes, each year we try to give them more and more tools in the toolbox in order to do, as Kim alluded to, clearly delineate and distinguish between derelict vessels versus our transient responsible boaters. But yes, the FWC bill has provisions in there to increase that authority. Also increase their authority to identify derelict vessels that are at risk of becoming derelict.
A point of information, one of the attendees is saying that Miami Beach is also considering setting up a mooring field to eliminate derelict vessels. And is asking if you are working with the city of Miami Beach on this, or if you've heard of it.
No, I have not heard of that one. Let's be clear, however, a local government has the authority to seek the creation of a mooring field through FWC. They don't need legislation to do that. And to my knowledge, none of our associations have ever opposed mooring fields. Many of us enjoy mooring fields as an option. What we have tended to oppose is the establishment of mooring fields as a blanket policy, as a strict alternative to all anchoring. There are certainly places where a mooring field makes a tremendous amount of sense and have been very successful. We, starting back in 2009, created the Anchoring and Mooring Pilot Program here in Florida and offered up to all local governments to participate in that. 4 of them did, and we created 4 new mooring fields: St. Augustine, Sarasota, St. Augustine, the Keys, and Fort Myers. So mooring fields can be a wonderful resource, and we don't oppose that. What we would oppose is legislation that bans anchoring in return for mooring fields.
Another question deals with the public trust doctrine and how permits and leasing agencies balance the interest of all parties. Do you have any thoughts on it? I
do. It's a key argument that we build into our advocacy continuously, that as I mentioned earlier, the demographics of Florida, like every state, are rapidly changing. You have more and more people who move here and buy waterfront property, and before long they see the water as, quote, their backyard, and they attempt to dominate that water to the exclusion of boaters. But what they forget is that the waterways are owned by everybody, by the public. It's in the public trust. The public trust doctrine says that those waters, those resources, just like our national parks, are in the public trust. They do not belong to the upland property owner at all. Now, that's not to say that upland property owners don't have some riparian rights, the right to wharf out, to build a dock, for example, the right to make reasonable use of their property out a reasonable distance from their property. But indeed, we constantly have to remind decision makers about the distinction between assets that are in the public trust and assets that are privately owned.
Okay, there's one more question that I'm picking up chat information or statements. And they basically want to, one question asks about what our position is related to long-term storage versus transient anchoring. Are you in favor of a 30-day maximum stay and eliminating long-term unoccupied boat storage? That sounds like an Ortega River question, or one that has some implications for Ortega River.
Yeah, and a question that says, am I in favor of, or probably not appropriate for me. It's probably more appropriate for Kingsley and for Kim to state the position of the organizations. My role is as an advocate to press and promote the collective decision on a particular issue that these organizations have come to. And perhaps I could defer to Kingsley and to Kim to explain how the Boaters' Rights Advocacy Committee, if you will, conducts its roundtable discussions among itself in collaboration with me, so that we ultimately come up with a position on those types of issues.
Sure, I can touch on that. And Kim, if you want to join in. What happens is, most of the time, we get a notice. We, being one of the 3 or 4 organizations, get information on an issue, or Jerry picks up information on an issue which is going to become a point of interest in the legislative session, and then we share that information among all 4 organizations. Each organization takes that information and does their own internal deliberations in terms of how they think that issue will impact their membership and what they're trying to promote as an organization. And then we come back together through conference calls, emails, and other kinds of communication, and we attempt to reach a compromise as to how we think we stand on this, how we can work together on it. And then when that decision's been made, we share that with Jerry. And it's not just Jerry's involved in the process. He helps us understand what's at stake. He helps us understand the alternatives and how things can be handled in different fashion than what might be proposed. And he helps us understand when precedents are being set and what the implications are. And because Jerry's such an avid voter himself, he has his own interests and concerns, and he expresses those from time to time. Kim, do you have any thoughts on this?
Not much to add there, Kingsley. It's very helpful to us when members alert us to some of the local issues. For example, the mooring field in Miami Beach that came up. I was not aware of that either. Right. Like SSCA, AGLCA does track legislation at the state level in the states along the Great Loop, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what's happening on the ground in individual states. So as Jerry pointed out, in Miami Beach, no state legislation is required for a municipality to put in that mooring field. Do we have an interest in ensuring that something like that happens in a way that benefits the community as well as the cruisers? Absolutely. Can our reach extend to every municipality? That's a good question. And a lot of that is going to depend on, members engaging in the process. So, we're doing what we can in all of the places we can. What really speaks the loudest at the state level is having representation like Jerry, and then at the municipal level, it's of course citizens. So, and Jerry talked a little bit about Ortega Landing, the Ortega River. Last year, the big difference maker and the way that issue came to our attention was initially through Jerry, as a bill was being filed at the state level. But then boots on the ground cruisers, who we took that information, spread that out amongst our members of the various organizations, and had enough people at a local meeting to really be the difference maker there. So last year that bill was actually withdrawn. We know it's coming back this year. We expect it to come back, and we expect the residents there, the waterfront property owners on the Ortega River, to have Jerry type representation for their interests this time around. So it's a continual fight. Yeah, Kingsley, I think you have some more probably that you want to add to the subject before I kind of go into
Yeah,
what
sure.
I'm
I've got,
designated to cover.
we
So
have
I'll send it back to you.
We have Jim Healy coming in. He represents MTOA, and I think he wants to say a couple of words. But let me, before Jim starts, there's another question I'll bring forward, and then we'll let Jim talk, and then we'll try and wrap this up a bit. The question is, do you anticipate the addition of local governments having the ability to charge a fee associated with anchoring, not in mooring fields, outside of mooring fields? We're in a specific city or local jurisdiction. These cities currently within the state law to require a daily fee or registration. And the only thing that I haven't heard of this in Florida. I do know that there are some states like in Rhode Island, and if you want to drop a mooring in for yourself, you pay a fee. You go to your local government or whatever the authority might be, and you request the ability to put a mooring in for your boat, and there's a fee associated with that. There's a similar thing at St. Thomas and U.S. Virgins. And I guess the question is, if I'm interpreting it properly, is that legal within the state of Florida at this stage? And do we know of any communities that might be doing it or plan to do it?
Kingsley, I think it's highly unlikely that we're at much risk of a fee or a tax for anchoring. That's not an issue that's commonly raised or proposed. It's not something that would likely court much favor among the majority party in the state of Florida, which jealously guards against any new taxes, no new taxes, and any new fees, no new fees. So I don't think that's a very big risk at all. To pick up one thing, pick up a little bit on what Kim was saying, and she's very kind to make reference to the successes that we have in the Capitol as lobbyists and advocates, but ultimately the strength of our advocacy is being able to add to the relationships that we have with legislators and our insight and our experience, adding to that the grassroots movement. Ultimately, the most powerful tool we have, the most effective argument that we have, is the number of us, those on this call, and our friends and family who are like-minded and live on the water or cruise on the water, who appreciate the freedoms that we have. Being able to, and my team, all of my lobbyists, being able to communicate to these legislators just how many of us there are, and being able to demonstrate how rapidly we can engage them through action alerts, getting them to show up at local hearings and city councils, even getting them to come to the Capitol. We, at times, will bring large numbers of boaters, cruisers, members of of our associations to the Capitol to come to the committee meeting rooms. They wear T-shirts. They wear these buttons that we have made that says that I anchor, and just say no to bans on anchoring. It's that type of grassroots movement that wouldn't exist if it were not for not only the associations, but also the boater advocacy and boater rights group and the resources that the individual members put into it, but also just them paying attention, following Kim and Kingsley and Jim and everybody's email action alerts and engaging. There's times when we have a bill coming up in a committee and we want to quickly get as many of our boaters to send an email to each and every one of the legislators on that committee. We circulate those email addresses, we circulate the phone numbers. That rapid grassroots engagement is a huge, huge part of the tools in our toolbox for defeating some of these bad bills.
Jim Healy, do you have some comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, thanks, Kingsley. Jerry and I have been working together more or less for 5 or 6 years now, Jerry, that I remember anyway. I think I was around when you first started working with this group. And I want to congratulate you for the work that you have done, because I think it's been enormously helpful. The 1 year that we managed to drop the ball hurt us badly and set us back. So thanks for your work. With regard to how the groups work closely together, Kim, we appointed by acclamation Kim to be our chairman, coalition-wise, and we meet together as a group and talk about issues, and then we decide amongst ourselves what we think are important, and then we bounce that off Jerry for his opinion of what's doable and what's not doable. In the legislative world, that matters. And you know, there's no point in trying to roll a big heavy rock uphill. So we try to work together, the four of us. We have just recently had a member join us who is a member of the, actually an officer of FCYC, the Florida Council of Yacht Clubs. They have a lobbying group, and our interests are very closely aligned. So the reach of our coalition, together with other groups, has been, I think, very helpful and important in helping Jerry and others make us successful as an organization. There's a lot we're holding off, and if we ever let go of this, it's going to tumble back down on us. So, Jerry, thank you for your help.
Well, let me just add to something that Jim's been saying, and then turn this over to Kim. My own personal experience in this is before I retired, I worked in and around government for 30 years, lobbying for many of them, mainly in the area of people with handicapping conditions. I've learned several things along the way. First of all, you've got to be there. You've got to have boots on the ground. They've got to be there every day during the session, and they've got to be there before and even after the session because of the potential for vetoes and other kinds of actions on the part of the executive branch. You've got to know the people. You've got to know the staff, you've got to know the legislators, and you've got to know the other lobbyists. They've got to know who you are and who you represent, because when they have a question or an issue, they're going to seek you out before they probably seek anybody else out. You got to know the process, that's pretty obvious. And you've got to know the subject. Legislators are not elected because they own a vote. This is a layman's legislature, and they get elected because people think they'll do a good job or they believe in certain things. Voting's not part of that usually. And so they have to be, as Jerry put forward, they have to be educated, and they have to understand what's at stake and what their other constituencies are that might not have been as forward in terms of how they actually got elected. And the other thing is you have to believe in what you're doing. What Jerry's doing for us is what I call white hat lobbying. That is to say, we don't have a lot of money that we support legislators with. We don't put together big contributions and supply that money to help elect legislators. We do it. We rely on people like Jerry to bring forward our issues and our points of view. And it's really white hat lobbying. So you have to believe in what you're doing when you do that kind of lobbying, and you have to be passionate about it. I've watched Jerry over the last year, and I can tell you he has the passion and he has the interest. He's taking the view you have is from his boat. He lives on his boat. There can't be a better representative for us than somebody who actually lives and breathes boating. So what happens when you don't have a lobbyist like Jerry? Jim just alluded to it. You get legislation, which we're still living with, which has eliminated areas of Fort Lauderdale from us being able to anchor. And it's a placeholder in the statute for anybody else who wants to come along and try to do the same thing. It's a problem. And the only way you fix that problem is you either change the statute, which is very hard to do once it gets established, or you have somebody like Jerry who's on the ball every day of the week, watching out for our interests. Kim, it's yours.
Thanks, Kingsley. And first of all, thanks to SSCA for hosting this evening so we can kind of get the word out about what's going on with legislation in Florida this year. I have been tasked with the big ask, which is an unusual circumstance for me. I grew up in a household where talking about money was considered rude. And here I am about to ask all of you for money. So the reason I'm willing to do that is because I am also very passionate about this issue. And I'm also a visual person, for those of you who don't know me. So I just want to show you a few real quick slides. I promise it'll be fast. As we have mentioned already, we lost some anchorages a few years ago when we were not engaged with Jerry in Tallahassee. This is a slide from Waterway Guide. The pink shaded areas are anchorages in the Fort Lauderdale area that I know a lot of you will recognize. And here in the Middle River, where overnight anchoring is now prohibited. And we've been working ever since to avoid having more anchorages fall into what is the state code 4108 is the section number, and you'll hear it referred to that. Right now, it's unfortunately all too easy for more representatives, more state legislators to come in and try to add areas of their districts to this section of code. Again, because I'm visual, this is roughly, obviously we're at a large scale, but this is roughly where the anchorages we have lost are located. The other kind of cautionary X's, we've talked a lot tonight about Ortega River. We've talked about Riviera Beach. And if you have not watched the meeting that's online that happened at Riviera Beach, it was startling for me, even though I've been doing this for a while. And it was, I was actually kind of personally offended to hear the city's consultant and the city's representative to talk about how they designed these mooring fields with the specific idea, with the size and shape, was to eliminate the anchorage. And they talked about everyone in the anchorage pumping overboard, which responsible cruisers know is not the case. Are there bad actors? Absolutely. Are the members of organizations like the four who have come together on this advocacy effort those bad actors? They're not. You know that, I know that. We really need to continue this process so we can avoid having more situations like that. And again, in Riviera Beach, the issue we can work on at the state level is making sure they're not able to expand the distance from the boundary of those mooring fields where you can anchor, and that's part of their strategy to eliminate the anchorage. This other X is really just indicating Madeira Beach. Again, not a state level issue, but they filed a municipal ordinance a year, maybe 2 years ago, that was in direct violation of the state statute that is in place to avoid this type of patchwork. And it took Jerry talking with their town attorney to make them realize that they needed to make a change to their town ordinance to be in line with the state statutes. So lots of work happening. I wanted to give you this visual picture because I know I see a lot of loopers on the call, and thank you for those who have joined. Not everyone is yet an active cruiser, at least, and not in Florida. So perhaps you're not familiar with these areas yet, but it's obviously kind of extending to all different corners of the state, which is why we really need representation in Tallahassee to try and combat this. I'm often asked when we're talking about the money portion, how much should I give? I do want to stress any amount helps. It does take dollars, and we may not like that that's the way it works, but it does take dollars to accomplish this important work. All of you know that the cruising lifestyle is not an inexpensive lifestyle. We know 2020 was a rough year across the board for every reason imaginable, just about, and for many financially as well. But we're really hoping you will look at what it costs to support your cruising lifestyle and look at contributing to this fund as part of maintaining that lifestyle. Even if you're not out there cruising yet, if you're still in the planning, if you're still in the dreaming phases, we want these anchorages to be here for you when it's your time to cruise Florida, because we all enjoy the freedom of being at anchor, the peace, the quiet, the solitude of enjoying these waterways that are there for the public interest. So we're asking you to contribute. here are the funds that you can use to contribute. All of these eventually work their way into the same pot. And I hope SSCAs, I hope you can see that there on my screen. It's hidden a little bit behind my control panel here, but the different websites you can go to, it's greatloop.org/contribute will take you directly to where you can contribute to this fund on the AGLCA website, mtoa.net, and they have a button right there on their homepage for their fund, and ssca.org/advocacy fund. Again, if you're a member of one of these organizations, we encourage you to contribute through the one that you're a member of, but eventually all of that money goes to the same place and goes towards funding these efforts in Tallahassee. It's only once the efforts are funded to have representation there at the Capitol that we can spread that information out to the grassroots. And then we'll be contacting you. And as Jerry said, and as Kingsley said, you'll see calls to action coming out where we'll say, because we have representation in Tallahassee, we know this bill is being heard by a committee today, and we need people there, or we need an email writing campaign. And, you know, in the past, we've kind of unleashed our members to write some emails to members of a committee, and Jerry's had to come back to us and say, tell them to stop. The message got through. The legislators hear it loud and clear. We're clogging their email. Let's back off a little bit. And that was kind of fun for me because it works. Cruisers are a great group of people. They're active, they're engaged, and we need that from you, and we're going to ask you to be continuing that, but we also do need the funds to be able to make the whole process work. So we hope that you will consider it. And with that, I will turn it back over. I'm not sure who's up next. I think we're closing it out.
Yes, Kim. And Jerry, thank you so much for being here and presenting. For Kingsley, for guiding us through the situation, for Jim to describe for MTOA and how Kim has done such a great job. Everyone's doing a great job. Now, one thing I will mention, everyone who's signed up for this, I will make arrangements to send the FWC proposed regulation and a link to the Georgia webinar so that they can see what is planned for Georgia, which may help. If anyone has questions, they are more than welcome to ask. We'll forward it to everyone. And in the chat, we'll look at the chat and make sure if there's any other questions that happen that we'll be able to answer them. This webinar will be posted for everyone to see. Each of the organizations will have this, and we hope you will share it with other people. And we appreciate you being here with us. Do you want to say anything? Well, thank you very much. We have one question. How much is currently in the fund? And what is the overall target? I think what I might want to do is I'll ask Kim to answer a question on that, Kingsley to answer a question, and maybe Jim.
Yeah, I can start off on that. Basically, the overall amount we're looking for this year is about, let me back up for a second. This is the very first year where we do not have a reserve coming into the year. So our fundraising efforts have done very well, but each year they've done a little bit less well, if that makes sense. So we usually have several $1,000s available coming into the year. This is the first time that is not the situation. So that's kind of a disappointing situation to be in. So to cover all of the expenses, and if we get some overage, we will cover, some travel expenses if we can for members to go to Tallahassee if needed. We have split up the goal based loosely on the number of members each organization has. So AGLCA's goal is $20,000 for this year. Kingsley, do you want to talk to SSCAs, or Jim, do you want to touch on MTOAs?
Kingsley, you need to unmute.
And SSCA's goal for this year for Jerry is $4,000, and we've raised about $1,200 at this point in time. One thing everyone needs to know is that Jerry's fee he gives us a discounted fee. I'm not sure exactly how much of a discount, but I suspect it's probably around 50%. But we're grateful for that. But that's where SSCA sits right now. A goal of 4,000, and we realized 1,200 roughly.
Yeah, and if I can just jump back in, the other part of the question was how much have we raised? As I said, AGLCA's goal for Florida is 20,000, and we've raised about 10 at this point. So we're about halfway there. And MTOA has reached their goal. I don't know if Jim's still available to comment on what their goal was and where they stand. I know they have reached their goal.
Yeah, yes, I am here. And the MTOA goal was, I think, around $4,800. I don't remember the exact number. Right, we are over our group's goal, not by a lot. I think we're at 51, maybe shy of 52, between 51 and $5,200. And I thank everybody for their participation in that. But I encourage everyone who can to continue to give, because this issue is important to all of us. Other states do use Florida as a bellwether, and stuff that happens here. I just saw today that there's stuff going on in both Missouri and in the state of Washington relative to these boater training certificates that we are facing. In the legislation that Jerry's going to share, there's a piece on that talks everybody's going to have that in Florida within 2 years and have it with them on the boat when they're on the water. So these things are spreading from state to state to state. And we do need to stay on top of it.
Yeah, and one other point to that, Kingsley mentioned that Jerry is very generous in the rate that he extends to us because of his passion for this issue. But he has also filled us in over the years that typically what the municipal governments are spending for their lobbyists on the anchoring issues when they are trying to get bans in place is upwards of $250,000 a year. So while the numbers we're talking about may sound like a lot, it's really actually pretty small amounts compared to the opposition. So we hope that you'll keep that in mind and contribute generously if you can.
Kim, this is Jim. You might want to give a brief status of the DeFever Cruisers.
DeFever Cruisers does approach it a little bit differently, and they actually fund their portion of the effort from their treasury. They're a smaller group than the others, so they have reached their goal because they don't do it as a fundraising effort the way the other groups do.
Kim, thank you very much for that. If there are no other questions, I see that Mark Gillespie had a question, but I think we've answered them all. We will send out responses and links and the FWC bill. If we have information to send out, we'll send that to all the participants. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy listening to this webinar in the future. Good night.